Cranial nerve number 1 is the olfactory nerve. It enters a nasal cavity through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid. It contains special sensory neurons that function towards smell. Cranial nerve number 2 is the optic nerve. It enters the orbit through the optic canal of the sphenoid bone, and it contains special sensory neurons that function towards vision. Cranial nerve number 3 is the oculomotor nerve. It enters the orbit through the superior orbital fissure in the sphenoid bone. It contains motor neurons, specifically parasympathetic motor neurons, that provide innervation to the muscles of the iris and ciliary body, and also synapse at ciliary ganglion located in the orbit. It also contains somatic motor neurons, which innervate most extraocular muscles. Cranial nerve number 4 is the trochlear nerve. It travels next to oculomotor, and it enters the orbit through the superior orbital fissure in the sphenoid bone. It contains purely somatic motor neurons, which provide innervation and controlling to the superior oblique extraocular muscle. Cranial nerve number 5 is the trigeminal nerve, which contains 3 branches. The first branch is the ophthalmic branch that enters the orbit through the superior orbital fissure in the sphenoid bone. It contains primarily general sensory innervation to the forehead, eye, and upper part of the nose. The second branch is a maxillary branch, which enters the face through the foramen rotundum in the sphenoid bone. It provides general sensory innervation to the middle of the face, cheeks, upper part of the mouth. The last branch is a mandibular branch, which enters the face through the foramen ovale in sphenoid bone. It provides general sensory innervation to the mandible, jawbone, and floor of mouth, as well as somatic motor innervation to the muscles of mastication, which include the temporalis and masseter. Cranial nerve number 6 is the abducens nerve. It enters the orbit through the superior orbital fissure and has purely somatic motor neurons that innervate and control the laterus rectus, which is an extraocular muscle. Cranial nerve number 7 is the facial nerve. It enters the ear through the internal auditory foramen in the temporal bone. It contains all 4 types of neurons, specifically special sensory innervation to taste to anterior tongue, somatic motor innervation to muscles of facial expression, and parasympathetic motor innervation to the lacrimal gland, where it synapses at the pectoropalatine ganglion, along with the sublingual and submandibular glands, which synapse at the submandibular ganglion. Cranial nerve number 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. It enters the inner ear through the internal auditory foramen in the temporal bone and sends branches towards the internal ear. It contains special sensory neurons that innervate hearing and balance. Cranial nerve number 9 is a glossopharyngeal nerve. It enters the neck through the jugular foramen between the occipital and temporal bones. It contains all 4 types of neurons, specifically special sensory to innervate the taste to posterior tongue, general sensory to innervate the pharynx, and parasympathetic motor innervation to the parotid gland, and the parasympathetic motor neurons synapse at the otic ganglion. Cranial nerve number 10 is the vagus nerve. It is also called the wandering nerve because it travels from the brain all the way down to the colon, and it is the longest cranial nerve and only one to exit the head and neck. It travels with the glossopharyngeal nerve. It enters the neck through the jugular foramen between the occipital and temporal bones. It also contains all 4 neuron types, specifically general sensory to innervate the larynx, somatic motor innervation to the muscles of the pharynx and larynx, and parasympathetic motor innervation to the thoracic and abdominal organs. Cranial nerve number 11 is the accessory nerve. It enters the neck through the jugular foramen and contains somatic motor innervation to the steronucleoid mastoid and the trapezius. Cranial nerve number 12 is a hypoglossal nerve, and it enters the neck through the hypoglossal foramen in the occipital bone. It contains somatic motor innervation to the tongue muscles.